My true life story with everyday life experiences. The city never slept, but Julie often wished she could. Another restless night stretched into dawn as I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling. The digital clock beside me glowed 3:42 a.m. My chest felt heavy, my thoughts loud and relentless. Every worry raced in circles: work deadlines, rent, whether my boss thought I was slipping. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to quiet. I pressed my palms against my eyes, whispering, "Please, just stop." But the thoughts never stopped. By morning, I dragged myself into the office with bloodshot eyes. No one knew how little I slept. No one knew how often I felt like I was suffocating in my own mind. On the outside, I wore the mask of competence. On the inside, I was unraveling. That week, the storm inside me reached its peak. During a client presentation, my throat tightened, my vision blurred, and panic seized my chest. Words disappeared from my tongue, replaced by silence. My colleagues stared as I stumbled through the slides, my hands trembling. By the time I sat down, shame pressed against my ribs harder than the panic had. That night, sitting on my balcony with the city lights flickering below, I thought, I can't keep living like this. The next morning, desperate for relief, I searched online. How to stop overthinking. How to calm anxiety.
How to sleep again.
The results were endless. One word kept appearing: mindfulness. I frowned at the screen. I'd heard the word before, tossed around in wellness blogs and TED Talks. To me, it sounded vague, maybe even gimmicky. How could sitting still and being present possibly fix what felt like a collapsing mind? But as I scrolled, one line stopped me. You cannot stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. John Kabat-Zinn. The sentence lingered. I didn't want to drown in my waves anymore. Maybe, just maybe, this mindfulness of a thing was worth trying. So, I decided to experiment it. My first experiment. That evening, I found a 10-minute guided mindfulness session on YouTube. I sat cross-legged on my living room floor, feeling ridiculous. The instructor's voice was calm, inviting me to close my eyes and bring attention to my breath. I tried. Immediately, my mind revolted. This is stupid. I am wasting my time. I should be finishing tomorrow's report. My chest tightened again. My thoughts grew louder. I almost shut it off. But then, something shifted. The instructor said, "Notice the thought. Don't fight it. Just return to the breath." So I did. I inhaled deeply. Exhaled slowly. One breath. Then another. My thoughts didn't vanish, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of space between them, like a pause button pressed on the chaos. 10 minutes later, when the session ended, I opened my eyes. The storm wasn't gone, but it felt a little less suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I whispered to myself, maybe I can do this. The first lesson. Over the next few days, I kept practicing. Just 10 minutes each morning. I sat quietly, focusing on my breath. Sometimes it felt impossible. My mind wandered to emails, bills, and worries. But each time, I remembered the instructor's words. Notice the thought. Return to the breath. Gradually, something changed. The next at work, when my chest began to tighten, I remembered to pause. I placed a hand on my stomach and inhaled slowly, counting to 4. The panic didn't vanish instantly, but it softened, like a storm cloud thinning. I could breathe again. I could think. It was the smallest of victories, but to me, it felt monumental. Mindfulness and the mind. Another evening, still on my curiosity, I researched more about what was happening to me. I discovered that mindfulness wasn't just a spiritual practice. It was deeply rooted in psychology and neuroscience. I read how mindfulness could reduce levels of cortisol, the stress hormone that had been flooding in my system for months. Studies showed it could calm the amygdala, the brain's fear center, and strengthen the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for decision-making and emotional regulation. I realized this wasn't about emptying the mind. It was about training the mind to see clearly and to respond instead of reacting. For the first time, I felt hope that maybe my storm wasn't permanent. Maybe my brain could actually change. The first night of sleep. A week later, something happened that nearly brought me to tears. After my night practiced, I lay down on bed. Instead of fighting my thoughts, I simply observed them. I noticed the stories my mind spun. Did I embarrass myself today? What if I fail tomorrow? And then gently let them pass, like clouds drifting across the sky. I focused on my breath.
In, out, in, out.
Somewhere between the rise and fall of my chest, I drifted into sleep. When I opened my eyes again, the clock read 7:02 a.m. I had slept through the night. The next morning, I walked to work differently. The city was still busy, horns blaring, people rushing. But for once, I noticed the warmth of sunlight on my skin. I noticed the sound of birds on the corner tree. I noticed the rhythm of my own footsteps. I realized mindfulness wasn't just something I did on the floor of my apartment. It was a way of seeing, a way of living. The storm inside me had disappeared. But for the first time in months, I felt a crack of light breaking through me. I thought mindfulness was just another buzzword. But in the storm of my mind, I discovered something powerful. The breath is an anchor. Awareness is a compass. And even in the darkest chaos, a moment of mindfulness can open the door to calm. This was only the beginning. Because what I was about to learn is that mindfulness doesn't just help us survive the storm, it transforms the way we live within it. This mindfulness approach led to my breaking point. I had always been good at hiding. Hiding the circles under my eyes behind concealer. Hiding the knots in my stomach behind a straight posture. Hiding the racing in my chest behind the practiced calm of my voice. But the thing about storms is, they always find cracks to break through. And my cracks were widening. 2 weeks into my new mindfulness routine, I walked into the office for the Monday strategy meeting. I had been feeling hopeful, sleep was slightly better, my mornings calmer. I thought maybe I was fixed. But stress doesn't vanish in a single breath. The meeting room was packed, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. My manager outlined upcoming deadlines, tight, demanding, nearly impossible. As I scribbled notes, I felt my chest constrict again. A familiar unease spread through me, creeping into my lungs, my hands, my throat. Not here. Not now, I said. My heart began to gallop. My palms grew slick with sweat. I heard words in the room, but none of them made sense anymore. The storm was back, bigger, louder, merciless. My vision blurred at the edges. I felt the urge to run. This was my breaking point. In the past, I knew what came next, the spiral. My thoughts would take control, spinning into disaster scenarios. My body would tighten like a fist. I would either freeze in panic or bolt for the door, embarrassed and broken. But this time, something different happened. Amid the noise in my head, a small, quiet memory surfaced. My breath. It was absurdly simple. But as the storm swelled, I closed my eyes for half a second and inhaled deep, slow, steady. Then counted 1, 2, 3, 4. I held it gently, then released. 4, 3, 2, 1. It was clumsy, awkward, but real. The panic didn't vanish. My chest still felt heavy, my thoughts still screamed. But the breath gave me something to hold on to, like grabbing a rope in rushing waters. And in that single moment of awareness, I realized something. The storm was inside me, not outside. And if it was inside, maybe I could change how I related to it. The meeting dragged on, but I practiced quietly. Inhale. Notice the panic. Exhale. Notice the panic softening. Each breath carved out just enough space for me to stay seated, to stay present, to survive the storm without running. It was messy, imperfect, but it was progress. By the end of the meeting, my shirt was damp, muscles sore from the fight, but I hadn't collapsed. For the first time in years, I had faced the wave differently. That night, I journaled, trying to make sense of what had happened. My pen scratched across the page. I almost lost it today. The panic came back hard. But when I breathed, it was like I wasn't drowning. I was watching the wave crash. I was still afraid, but I wasn't gone. Maybe that's what mindfulness is. Not killing the fear, just not letting it own me. I stared at those words. Something about them felt true, which enabled me understood the science behind it. Curious again, I researched what was happening in my brain. I learned about the amygdala, the brain's alarm system. For years, my amygdala had been firing like a car alarm at every little stressor, overwhelming my system. But studies showed mindfulness could literally shrink the amygdala's reactivity over time, while strengthening the prefrontal cortex, the rational, calm part of the brain. It wasn't magic. It was biology. Every breath I took in awareness wasn't just calming me in a moment, it was reshaping my brain's response to stress. That thought lit a spark of hope in me. Later that week, the storm tested me once more. I was asked to lead another small presentation. My body remembered the last collapse, the blank stares, the shame. As I stood at the front of the room, the familiar panic rose like fire in my veins. My throat tightened. My palms sweated. But this time, I did fight it. Instead, I remembered my anchor. I planted my feet on the floor, inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly. I whispered silently, "This is just a wave. Breathe through it." I noticed the fear. I noticed the thoughts screaming, "You'll fail. You'll embarrass yourself again." But I didn't wrestle them. Rather, I simply let them pass like clouds across the sky. And as I breathed, I began to speak. My voice trembled at first, but steadied. Sentence by sentence, I made it through. When it ended, I realized something shocking. I had collapsed. I had survived. I observed a new kind of strength. Walking back to my desk, my heart still pounded. But underneath the trembling, there was pride. Not the pride of perfection, but the pride of endurance. I realized that mindfulness wasn't about becoming calm all the time. It was about finding space inside the chaos. It was about choosing how to respond when the storm came. And that was a strength I had never known I had. The shift in perspective. Over the next few weeks, I kept practicing. Every panic trigger became an opportunity. In traffic jams, instead of clenching the wheel and cursing, I noticed the tension in my jaw and softened it with a breath. In crowded elevators, instead of feeling trapped, I focused on the sensation of my feet pressing the floor, grounding myself. At late-night spirals, instead of fighting my thoughts, I observed them and let them pass. Slowly, I began to see. My mental health wasn't defined by the storm, but by how I sailed within it. My breaking point becomes a turning point. One evening, I visited my neighbor, Mrs. Charity, the older woman who had once mentioned meditation. Over tea, I told her about my panic and how mindfulness was helping. She smiled warmly and said, "Most people think strength means pushing the storm away," she said. But mindfulness teaches us that strength is sitting in the storm and remembering you as the sky, not the clouds. I sat in silence, the words sinking deep. For months, I had believed I was broken, weak, powerless. But maybe I wasn't broken at all. Maybe I was learning to see myself differently. For you watching this story, remember, I had reached my breaking point. But mindfulness showed me that a breaking point can become a turning point. Panic didn't vanish overnight, but my relationship to it began to change. The breath became my anchor. Awareness became my refuge. And with every moment of mindfulness, the storm lost a little of its power. But what I didn't yet know is this. The practice that helped me survive panic would soon transform every corner of my life and sleep, my self-talk, my relationships. Because mindfulness doesn't just heal the mind. It reshapes the way we live, moment by moment. Therefore, this is how mindfulness began to heal my sleep and rest, one of the deepest ways it improves mental health. Night had always been my enemy. When the world grew quiet, my mind grew loud. Every unresolved worry, every mistake, every fear crawled out from the shadows and filled the silence. Why did I stutter during the meeting? What if tomorrow goes wrong? What if I never get better? The ceiling above me had become a screen for my anxieties. Hours ticked by. My body lay stiff, wired with exhaustion. The clock would crawl to 2 a.m., then 3 o'clock, sometimes 4 o'clock. I would eventually collapse into restless half-sleep, only to wake foggy, irritable, already defeated. Sleep deprivation gnawed at my sanity. Some days, I forgot words mid-sentence. Some days, the panic was worse simply because my body had no strength left to fight it. It was a vicious cycle. Anxiety stole my sleep, and sleeplessness fed up my anxiety. But I took a decision that something had to break. One late night, as I lay staring at the ceiling again, I remembered something from a mindfulness article. Sleep is not forced. It is allowed. The more we fight it, the further it runs. Mindfulness teaches us to invite rest by softening into the present moment. The words repeated in my mind like a mantra. Not forced. Allowed. Maybe I thought I'd been trying too hard, fighting sleep as if it were an enemy. But what if I treated it like a guest, invited with gentleness? That night, instead of grabbing my phone or tossing in frustration, I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "Okay, just the breath. Nothing else." I placed one hand on my chest, another on the stomach. Slowly, I inhaled. The air expanded my lungs, lifted my ribs. Slowly, I exhaled, feeling the release. At first, my mind protested. "This won't work. You're wasting time. You'll still be awake at 4 a.m. But instead of fighting the thoughts, I observed them, thinking, worrying. Then I returned to the breath.
In, out, in, out.
Some minutes passed. My body began to loosen. Shoulders sank. Jaw softened. For the first time in years, I noticed how tension had become my default state, every muscle gripping, as if bracing for impact. As I exhaled, something gave way inside me. I did remember when it happened, but the next thing I knew, sunlight was peeking through the curtains. The clock read 6:58 a.m. I stood up slowly, disbelief spreading across my face. I had slept deeply, peacefully, whispering to myself. The ripple effect. That day at work felt different. My body, though still tired, carried a lightness. My thoughts were clearer, less frantic. I laughed at a coworker's joke without forcing it. Sleep hadn't solved everything, but it was like water poured onto parched soil. A foundation for healing. I thought if one night of mindful breathing can do this, what could weeks, months, years of practice bring? Learning to let go. Over the following weeks, I developed a new ritual. Each night, instead of scrolling on my phone, I dimmed the lights, sat on my bed, and practiced a short mindfulness body scan. I would close my eyes, bring attention to my forehead, my jaw, my shoulders, slowly scanning downward, noticing tension and softening it. Then I would return to the breath. Sometimes thoughts came. Sometimes anxiety tried to grip on me again. But instead of spiraling, I let them pass. I reminded myself, sleep is not forced. It is allowed. And slowly I drifted into rest. The science behind the calm. Curious as always, I read more about why mindfulness was helping my sleep. I learned that constant overthinking activated the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight mode, which pumped adrenaline into my bloodstream long after bedtime. But mindfulness, through slow breathing and awareness, triggered the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's rest and digest mode. This shift lowered my heart rate, relaxed my muscles, and released melatonin, the hormone that prepared the body for sleep. It wasn't magic. It was physiology. And it meant me wasn't broken. My body knew how to rest, I just had to give it permission. The night I almost relapsed. One Friday, after an overwhelming week of deadlines, I felt the storm creeping back. My mind raced as I lay in bed, replaying mistakes, predicting disasters. By 1 a.m., panic rose. What if the insomnia comes back? What if I can't sleep tonight? The fear itself became the barrier. But then I remembered. I sat up, closed my eyes, and placed a hand over my heart. I whispered gently, "It's okay. I don't need to sleep right now. I just need to breathe." I inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly. The panic didn't vanish instantly, but breath by breath, the fear softened. My mind stopped fighting. My body surrendered. An hour later, I was asleep. The storm had tested me, but mindfulness had carried me through. Healing beyond my sleep. The change wasn't only at night. With better sleep, I noticed new shifts in my mental health. Mornings were calmer. Instead of waking with dread, I woke with clarity. Panic lessened. Rested, my body was stronger, less vulnerable to stress. Mood improved. The fog of exhaustion lifted, making room for small joys. One evening, while cooking dinner, I caught myself humming. I paused, surprised. When was last had I hummed, without forcing happiness? It felt like my mind, once a battlefield, was beginning to remember peace. My conversation with Mrs. Charity. One afternoon, I ran into Mrs. Charity, the neighbor who had nudged toward mindfulness. I told her about my sleep improvement. Her eyes crinkled with a knowing smile. Sleep is the body's natural medicine, she said. But the mind must step out of the way. That's what mindfulness teaches. It shows the mind how to let the body heal itself. I nodded, my chest warm with gratitude. I realized that was just learning a skill. I was rebuilding a relationship with myself. The method had led me to begin to see breath as a friend. As weeks passed, I no longer dreaded bedtime. My ritual became sacred. Dim lights, quiet room, slow breaths. Sometimes I fell asleep quickly. Sometimes it took longer. But either way, the anxiety that once haunted my nights had loosened its grip. I began to see my breath differently, not as something automatic, but as a friend, always there, always ready to guide me back to calm. It's pertinent as well as medicinal as you watch and listen to begin to adopt the same method, as I once believed my sleepless nights were proof that I was broken. But mindfulness showed me something different. Rest is not forced, it is invited. By learning to breathe, to notice, to release, I began to heal one of the deepest wounds of my anxiety and insomnia. And with each night of mindful rest, my mind grew steadier, my body stronger, my heart lighter. The first breath had given me sleep. The next breaths would give me something even greater, the power to see my thoughts, not as enemies, but as passing clouds in the vast sky of my awareness.